Hello again. I have mentioned on more than one occasion that I spent the years of my secondary education and early manhood in the London Borough of Redbridge, to be precise, Seven Kings, which is on the edge of Ilford. In the 1960s, this was a deadly dull area where little of interest ever seemed to happen. There had been a stabbing there, long time before, of course. This was the murder of Percy Thompson in 1923, for which his wife Edith Thompson and her lover Freddie Bywaters were subsequently hanged. This had happened 40 years earlier, but children could still point to the spot in Belgrave Road where Edith Thompson's husband had bled to death after being stabbed. It was such a remarkable circumstance. The idea of somebody being stabbed to death in the street in Ilford was absolutely hypnotic. It was a fascinating topic. The idea that anything like that could have happened in such a dull, staid area. Such a novelty in 1960s London that even all those years later, the crime exercised a horrible fascination. Fast forward 60 years, and Ilford is now a very different place. Of course, like many parts of London, there are sizable numbers of black people and those whose families have their origin in the Indian subcontinent. Murders, especially stabbings, are now so common around that part of the capital that one doesn't need to look back 40 years for the last example. My brother still lives in Ilford and he keeps me posted on what is essentially the complete destruction of what used to be a quiet and peaceful backwater and the way in which it has now been converted into a violent ghetto. I also read the online edition of the Ilford Recorder, the local newspaper, and pretty interesting reading it makes too. In the description to this video I give a link to the news section of the current edition of the Ilford Recorder. Let's have a look at what we can see there. The most obvious thing which grabs the attention is that last week 2 people were stabbed to death. A number of young people are also currently on trial for another murder by stabbing in that general area. Looking at these news items, one cannot fail to observe that every single person connected with them belongs to some minority or other. In other words, it's not just that the area has deteriorated and there's now more crime than was once the case. That might just be a general trend, the kind of thing which could happen over the course of 60 years with or without immigration. No, the truth is that the violence is inextricably linked to and associated with foreigners and immigrants. We may of course debate why this should be so, but that it is the case is quite certain. Let's have a look then at what we can see in the Ilford Recorder, starting with the 2 murders last week. On Saturday, March 19th, a man of Pakistani origin called Imran Isat was stabbed to death in Newbury Park, which is a district adjacent to Seven Kings. 4 days later, a black teenager called Tyler Hurley was stabbed to death on a bus in Chadwell Heath, which is a little way from Seven Kings. This crime took place in broad daylight at about 4 in the afternoon after the schools let out. He was just 16 years old. Another teenager called Carlton Tanoué, I imagine he's also Caribbean from the name, has been charged with murder. While these murders were taking place, 6 young people were on trial at the Old Bailey for another murder by stabbing. This one took place at Harold Hill near Romford. The victim was a man called Daniel Lascos, and those accused of killing him are named René Saint-Ange, Lucian Barnes, Raheem Green Matthews, Joshua Kerr and Callum Hans. From their names I'm fairly sure that all are of Caribbean origin. These then are the kind of news items to be found in a local newspaper which once upon a time reported nothing more exciting than flower shows and the opening of a new department store. What's more, Yes, here is Isaiah Olugosi, an African who was in prison awaiting sentence after having been arrested in Ilford and convicted for trafficking in and exploiting vulnerable girls to support a large-scale fraud operation. He has died in prison. Then too we have Kamran Haider, who murdered his girlfriend's 16-month-old daughter. He was living at the time in Goodmays, which is next to Seven Kings. There we have a selection of violent deaths and no mistake. A man from Ilford also made the national news, of course. Jubair Chowdhury of De Vere Gardens off Cranbrook Road in Ilford was in the headlines the other week for a complicated series of frauds relating to motor vehicles, in the course of which it was revealed in court that he had identification for no fewer than 17 separate identities. He is, of course, Pakistani. Also in the Ilford Recorder this month was an appeal for information regarding some people wanted in the connection with the murder of Ricardo Fuller, a black guy, in Ilford last year. Edmund Moses Tucker, Emmanuel Tamwagisiri and Jermaine Afari Achenkora have been charged with murder, and now the police are trying to track down Abu Bakr Tarawali and Ahmed Sese as well. The decline of once peaceful areas such as Ilford are not just a natural consequence of times changing and bringing with them different values and perhaps wilder and less disciplined behaviour. Old people often complain about how things are not as good as they were in the old days, but this is something quite different. What we are looking at here is a once quiet area with no violence becoming a place where murder and violent crime are alarmingly common. In every case, these crimes are committed by people whose families do not have their root in this country. Does anybody seriously imagine that this is no more than mere coincidence?